The moment I slit open the envelope and saw the name of the person who betrayed my husband, written in his trembling final handwriting, something inside me shattered, because he had known everything long before his death, and he had chosen me, not the courts, not his board, not even the police, to carry out the justice he could not finish. My breath froze. The room spun, and for the first time since I buried him, my grief turned into iron. If you have ever trusted someone who later plotted behind your back, drop a comment telling me where you are watching from, and subscribe now before the next twist arrives. My name is Lydia Harrow, widow of Grant Harrow, founder of Harrow Industries, a timber empire built from the endless forests of the Northern Valley. People often speak of success as though it is born from a single man's ambition, but the truth is quieter, less glamorous. Success is built on the back of a marriage, on the late nights a wife spends waiting by the lamp, on the meals that grow cold, on the conversations sacrificed for exhaustion, on the belief that love can withstand any season. I poured 20 years of my life into my husband's dream. While he carved his name into contracts and deeds, I held our home together like a seamstress, mending tears no one else noticed. Our mornings smelled of pine sap and wet lumber. He would bring bits of bark home to show me the color of new growth in the mill yards. Our evenings were quiet, not from lack of love, but from shared fatigue, the kind that settles in married bones like a familiar ache. We came from nothing, two young dreamers living off borrowed hope. We married in a small chapel built of soft wood that creaked each time the wind breathed. We built our first house with our own hands, Grant hammering nails with impatience, while I painted the windowsills with a care he claimed slowed him down. But that was our life. His speed, my steadiness. He reached, and I grounded. He built, and I sustained. He led, and I whispered truth into his weary nights. People rarely saw me at board meetings or public ceremonies. I never wanted accolades. My satisfaction came from quiet places, balanced ledgers, timely payrolls, a home filled with warmth after his difficult days. I shaped his world so he could shape the company. But even in the loveliest marriages, storms gather far before the sky turns dark. The shift began with the arrival of Stellan Crowder, Grant's cousin, a man with sharp eyes and a smile groomed for persuasion. He re-entered our lives after years of silence, breezing into our home as though he had been there every season. At first, I embraced his presence. Grant had always hoped the two of them would reconnect. But the house stiffened around him. I felt it before I understood it. The tension that rises when someone steps into a room with intentions cloaked beneath courtesy. He hovered around Grant, inserting himself into matters he barely understood. He toured the mills, questioned long-standing staff, interfered with decisions he had no right to influence. He spoke as though he had built the company, though he had not lifted a single beam. "He's eager to help," Grant said once, though his voice lacked conviction. I noticed more than eagerness. I noticed hunger. A hunger that had nothing to do with belonging and everything to do with power. That was when I first saw fear flicker in Grant's eyes. It was small at first, barely a tremor in his voice when he returned home late. He would sit in his study long after midnight, staring at documents with a heaviness that made the lamp seem too dim for the room. Sometimes I found him gripping the edge of his desk, breathing deeply as though steadying himself. "Are you well?" I asked more than once. His answer never changed. "I'm handling it." Handling what? I should have insisted. I should have pressed him harder. But marriages learn their rhythms, and ours had always been built on trust. I believed he would never hide something that could threaten us. I was wrong. In the month before he passed, Grant began acting like a man racing time. He touched my cheek as though memorizing its warmth. He kissed my forehead with a longing that frightened me. He held my hands longer, studied my face longer, lingered at the doorway longer. One night, he said, "My Lydia, promise me something." "What is it?" "If ever you feel the ground shifting under your feet, do not retreat. Stand. Fight. Do not let anyone undo what we built." I laughed softly, thinking he was merely sentimental. But he did not laugh. He only squeezed my hands and whispered, "You're stronger than you know." It strikes me now that he spoke like a man who expected to leave soon and feared what would happen to me after. I didn't know he was preparing me. I didn't know he was trying to place armor on my heart. I didn't know he suspected a betrayal that ran deeper than illness. If I had known, I would have asked more questions. I would have sat beside him and demanded the truth. But love, in its gentlest form, trusts even when it shouldn't. And trust was the knife the world used to cut me open. Grant was too ill to attend, so I went in his stead. The long walnut table gleamed beneath chandelier light, and the air smelled of roasted meat and expensive wine. Stellan stood at the head, speaking as though he was the one the shareholders owed their fortunes to. His confidence filled the room like smoke. When he misquoted a quarterly figure, I corrected him gently, privately even. He laughed. Loudly, mockingly. "Lydia, numbers can be quite complex. Leave business to those equipped to handle it." Laughter followed. Men who depended on my husband's brilliance. Men whose salaries I had personally balanced for years.
My face burned. My heart shrunk. That should have been my second warning, but grief had not yet sharpened my vision. A week later, I arrived early at the office to bring updated ledgers. Through the frosted glass, I heard young executives speaking with careless arrogance. "She can't run a company. She doesn't even know what we do here. Once he's gone, Stellan will take over. She'll crumble. She's just the widow. They always fall apart." They laughed. At me, at my presumed weakness, at the future they assumed they could shape without consequence. I stood there holding the ledgers that kept their world functioning, but I was too loyal to see what was coming. We laid Grant to rest under a sky too bright for morning. When the crowd dispersed, Stellan approached me with a somber expression. He put a hand on my shoulder and leaned in. "Don't worry, Lydia. Harrow Industries will be in capable hands now." He didn't say, "your hands." He didn't even pretend to. It was an insult disguised as comfort, and it lodged inside me like a splinter. During a board briefing held only 10 days after Grant's passing, Stellan stood at the podium and introduced himself as acting head of Harrow Industries. There had been no vote, no discussion, no consent, just entitlement. I stood and corrected him, firm but calm. A few board members exchanged glances, their expressions embarrassed on his behalf, or perhaps on mine. The humiliation suffocated me. My husband had not even been gone a month, and already they were rearranging his kingdom as though I were a mild inconvenience to be brushed aside. That should have been my final warning. But hope is a stubborn thing, and I still believed decency might return to the room. Decency never did. 1 week after the funeral, the phone rang. It was Jonas Alder, my husband's long-trusted lawyer. "Lydia, Grant left something for you. It must be read alone. My heart tightened. When Jonas handed me the small envelope sealed with dark green wax, the sight of Grant's handwriting stole the air from my chest.
I sat in his study, the room that still smelled of cedar and tobacco, and opened it. Inside were 2 more envelopes, one thick, one thin. My hands trembled as I opened the thicker one. Documents spilled onto the desk. Bank transfers, forged signatures, transcripts of meetings, handwritten notes, and a small metallic recorder. I pressed play. Stellan's voice filled the quiet. Once he's gone, we move immediately. Lydia's naive. She'll sign whatever we put in front of her. She trusts too easily. I froze. My heart hammered. My breath trembled. Another recording followed. Stellan's voice again, colder. She won't fight us. Women like her break under pressure. She'll hand the company over and retreat into widowhood. My vision blurred with tears. Then I opened the second envelope, the thin one. Inside were a resignation letter forged in my handwriting, a psychological evaluation labeling me unstable, a property transfer agreement stripping me of ownership, a prepared press statement announcing Stellan as the new leader. My mouth tasted like metal. My hand shook violently. They had planned everything: the takeover, the humiliation, the narrative that would silence me, the removal of my name from the legacy I helped build. I sank to the floor, shaking with grief and fury so deep it felt like a second death. Grant knew. He had known for months. He gathered this evidence while dying. He fought quietly because he did not want to burden me until he was gone. He trusted me to finish what he could not. When that realization settled in my bones, my tears slowed, my breaths steadied. I rose from the floor with a spine no longer softened by sadness. "Very well," I whispered to the room. "They want a weak widow? I will give them a storm. Subscribe now if you want to see how a quiet woman becomes the downfall of every man who wronged her." I did not confront Stellan. I did not raise my voice or show my wounds. Revenge is not born in noise. It grows in silence. We met at dawn the next day in his small, book-lined office. Jonas had aged since Grant's death. Lines deepened around his eyes, his posture folded by sorrow. When he saw the documents, his jaw clenched. "Your husband suspected this. He gathered everything we need. Why didn't he tell me? He wanted to protect you until he no longer could." Grant had loved me fiercely, but this was more than love. This was faith. We placed recording devices in meeting rooms where I was too fragile to attend. Their arrogance made them reckless. I gathered new ledgers. Jonas contacted auditors. We traced every missing dollar, every forged signature. Each discovery tightened the noose. His accounts were quietly monitored. His property transactions were delayed. His influence over the board was weakened. His alliances began to crumble under silent investigation. He didn't notice. Men like him never notice a woman they think is broken. At the next board meeting, Stellan approached me gently. "Lydia, you've suffered enough. Let us handle things. Just sign these documents." I lowered my gaze, voice soft. "Thank you, Stellan. I'll review them tonight." He smiled, thinking victory was near. He didn't notice the recorder in my sleeve. The perfect battleground came in the form of the Founders' Memorial Banquet, an annual event to celebrate Grant's legacy. Stellan planned to use it to crown himself king. I planned to use it to destroy him. Jonas and I spent 3 weeks preparing every detail. By the time the banquet approached, the trap was set. The stage was built. The witnesses were invited, and Stellan walked straight into the grave he dug for others. The night of the Founders' Memorial Banquet arrived with the kind of winter cold that makes breath hang in the air like unanswered questions. The sky above the city was a dull sheet of iron, and a thin wind chased dry leaves along the pavement as my driver pulled up before the grand hall. For a long moment, I did not move. The building loomed above me, all stone columns and tall windows, every pane glowing with warm golden light. Inside, the men who doubted me and the man who tried to erase me were already gathering, glasses in hand, speaking comfortable lies beneath chandeliers my husband had chosen. My heart did not race. It had done all its racing in the weeks before tonight. Now it beat with a slow, steady insistence, like a drum that knew exactly when it would sound. I stepped out of the car. The air sliced at my cheeks. My black velvet gown absorbed the cold, the fabric heavy and comforting against my skin. I adjusted my gloves and lifted my chin. Each rising breath formed a small cloud that vanished almost as soon as it appeared. It felt appropriate. The old version of me had done the same, appeared, disappeared, leaving little trace in the rooms where decisions were made. Not tonight. Inside the hall, everything gleamed. Crystal chandeliers spilled light across polished walnut floors. The scent of roasted meats, red wine, and beeswax polish wrapped itself around the guests, who moved in measured clusters. The walls were paneled in dark wood, and along them hung portraits of former leaders, men with gold frames around their faces and pride painted into their eyes. At the far end of the room, centered between two tall windows, hung the last portrait commissioned before Grant died. His portrait. The painter had caught him in a moment of calm authority, one hand resting on his desk, the other at his side. His eyes, dark and thoughtful, seemed to follow the movement of the room. Every time I looked at that painting, I felt as though he were still evaluating the people who entered his world. Tonight, those painted eyes would watch the truth unfold. I lingered near one of the tall windows, letting my gaze roam. Men in dark suits, their collars starched just enough to show importance. Women in deep blues, emeralds, burgundies, their jewelry catching the chandelier's light. Laughter rose in polished bursts, never too loud, never too genuine. A server passed with a tray of champagne. I took a glass, not because I wanted to drink, but because it gave my hands something to hold. Across the room, beneath Grant's portrait, stood Stellan Crowder. He was the only person in the hall who seemed perfectly at ease. His hair was combed back neatly, his suit fitted him like habit. His tie was a deep red, too close to the color of dried blood for my liking. He spoke with practiced charm to a small circle of board members, his hand resting lightly on one man's shoulder. They laughed at something he said, their expressions a mixture of respect and dependence. Stellan glanced over the room, and his gaze brushed past me, not lingering long enough to recognize anything dangerous. In his mind, I was still the grieving widow, fragile and manageable. He had no idea that the floor beneath his polished shoes was already cracking. Near the stage, I saw Jonas Alder. He stood beside the master of ceremonies, looking entirely ordinary to anyone who did not know the weight he carried in his briefcase and in his mind. When his eyes met mine, he gave the slightest nod. Everything is ready. I drew in a deep breath and let my shoulders relax. The fear I might once have felt had burned out long ago, consumed by the fires of humiliation and discovery. In its place lived something clearer, almost cold, purpose sharpened into a blade. The orchestra played their opening piece, strings rising and falling like a tide. When the music drew to a close, the master of ceremonies stepped up to the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice ringing gently against the high ceiling.
Tonight, we gather to honor the vision and legacy of the man who built this company from the soil of the valley to the heights of the city, Grant Harrow. There was a pause. Then, applause, full, sincere, echoing. I felt it move through me, stirring memories. Grant standing in muddy boots in the first mill, Grant staying up late to sign contracts, Grant resting his head in his hands on difficult days. He had poured his life into the work these people now celebrated.
The applause faded. The master of ceremonies continued. We also look to the future. Harrow Industries must not only remember where it came from, but know where it is going. In that spirit, it is my privilege to invite to the stage the man who will guide us forward into the next chapter. He turned toward Stellan and extended his arm. Mr. Stellan Crowder. The phrase struck the air like a stone thrown into still water. Stellan placed a hand over his heart in a show of modesty, then began his walk toward the stage. Chairs shifted, a polite murmur of expectation moved through the room. He reached the steps, and the lights went out. Darkness slammed across the hall with such suddenness that several people cried out. A glass shattered somewhere to my right. The chandeliers, moments ago a fountain of light, became dark ornaments hanging in the gloom. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the tight, collective intake of breath. Then a small electrical click sounded above the stage. A single beam of white light cut through the dark and struck the large screen mounted behind the podium. Dust motes glittered in its path like disturbed snow. Static flickered for a moment. Then an image sharpened into view and a voice filled the room. Once he's gone, we move fast. Lydia is naive. She will sign whatever we put in front of her. She trusts too easily. The words rolled like thunder. The voice was Stellan's. Murmurs exploded along the tables. Is that him? What is this? Good heavens! On the screen, taken from the angle of a camera hidden high in a corner, Stellan sat at a conference table. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed loosely over his chest, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. The recorded Stellan continued. She will not fight. Women like her break under pressure. She will hand the company over and disappear. Beside him in the recording sat two other men, their faces partially turned away from the camera. They laughed. Short, ugly sounds. In the present, the real Stellan stood frozen halfway up the steps, 1 foot on the first stair, bathed in the pale glow of the projection. This is out of context, he called out, his voice louder than necessary. Turn it off, now. No one moved to obey. The recording continued. Once we have the letter and the evaluation in place, the Stellan on the screen said, no one will question her stepping aside. They will call it mercy. The image changed. Now a document filled the screen, my supposed resignation letter. Every word was visible, my name neatly typed at the bottom, my signature imitated with almost insulting care. Those close to the front gasped. I watched faces change, amusement melting into alarm, confusion hardening into quiet anger. The master of ceremonies stepped back from the podium, color draining from his face. He seemed to realize only then that the evening he'd rehearsed had been replaced by a trial. Stellan tried again. Lydia is grieving, he shouted. She does not understand what she is doing. Jonas, stop this at once. That was Jonas's cue. He stepped onto the stage from the side, carrying a folder thick with paper. He moved with the calm assurance of a man whose work had already been checked and approved by higher authorities. Ladies and gentlemen, Jonas said evenly into the microphone, the recordings and documents you are seeing tonight were gathered by your late founder, Grant Harrow, in the months before his death. They have been verified by independent auditors and reviewed by law enforcement. Silence dropped like a curtain. I rose from my seat. My legs carried me down the aisle, the soft carpet swallowing the sound of my steps. Faces turned toward me as I passed, some filled with surprise, others with a dawning understanding that the widow who had remained quiet for so long had not been idle. Jonas shifted aside as I reached the podium. The bright cone of projection light warmed my back. The hall beyond was a sea of pale faces, glittering glasses, and arrested breaths. I lifted the forged resignation letter from the folder. "This document," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the hushed hall, "was prepared to be released shortly after my husband's funeral. It states that I voluntarily resigned my position and ownership in Harrow Industries due to emotional instability." The projector split the screen. On one side, the forged letter. On the other, images of my true handwriting and signatures from earlier years, notes I had written to staff, annotations in financial reports, personal correspondences. Most of you have received letters or notes from me over the years. You know how I write. You know the turns of phrase I use. A board member near the front leaned forward, eyes scanning the documents with growing dismay. Another removed his glasses and pressed his fingers against his eyelids, as though trying to erase what he saw. "This is not my resignation. This is a theft, clothed in false concern." The image changed again. Now the false psychological evaluation appeared. Cold, clinical, describing me as unstable, prone to erratic decisions, unsuitable for executive leadership. A few women at the side tables exchanged glances that carried the heavy understanding of how easily a woman's voice can be discounted. I let the silence stretch. Then Jonas signaled the technician. The screen changed one final time. Grant appeared. He sat at his desk, shoulders thinner than I remembered, skin drawn tight around his cheekbones. Yet his eyes were clear, sharp, unwavering. The lamplight behind him cast half his face in shadow, giving him the look of a man already halfway between this world and whatever waited beyond it. "My name is Grant Harrow," he said, his voice softer than usual, but steady. "If you are seeing this, it means I am no longer alive. It also means that my cousin, Stellan Crowder, has attempted to secure control of Harrow Industries through fraud and manipulation." Someone in the room whispered a prayer. "I discovered financial discrepancies, forged signatures, and plans to declare my wife Lydia unfit to lead. I have documented everything. All relevant material has been placed in the care of my attorney, Jonas Alder, with the instruction that it be revealed if Lydia is threatened, coerced, or undermined following my death." His shoulders rose and fell with effort. He paused, then spoke again. "To the board," he said, "if there is any integrity left among you, stand with my wife. She has more courage than any man in this room has ever given her credit for. She has carried this company's burdens quietly for years. If you seek the future I fought for, let her lead." He swallowed, eyes glistening. "To my wife," he added, voice thickening, "if you are watching this, it means I did not have the strength to tell you everything in time. I am sorry. I trusted that when you knew the truth, you would do what I could not. I know you will not break." The recording ended. For a few seconds there was nothing, no sound, no movement. Then the heavy double doors at the back of the hall opened. Two uniformed officers entered, their footsteps echoing along the marble floor. They walked with quiet certainty toward the front, through aisles of stunned guests. "Stellan Crowder?" the taller officer asked, voice firm but calm. Stellan, who had not moved since the recording began, turned slowly. His complexion had taken on a grayish cast. "You are under arrest for corporate fraud, conspiracy, forgery, and attempted unlawful seizure of Harrow Industries," the officer said. "This is outrageous," Stellan snapped. "You cannot march in here like this. This is a private function." "The warrant is lawful. You may speak further with your counsel." They took hold of his arms. He tried to pull away, but the movement lacked conviction. His gaze flew to the board members, searching for support. None of them stepped forward. Even those who had once laughed at his private jokes now studied the tablecloths as if they had never known him. As they led him past the stage, he looked up at me. He hissed under his breath, "You think this is over? You will regret this." I held his gaze without flinching. "No," I said quietly, "you will." The officers guided him down the aisle and out through the doors that closed behind him with a deep, resonant thud that reverberated through the hall like the closing of a vault. Silence remained in his wake. Then, from somewhere near the back, a single pair of hands began to clap. It was hesitant at first, but then others joined, scattered at first, then gathering strength, until the hall filled with the sound of applause. They were not cheering his downfall alone. They were acknowledging the truth. They were acknowledging that the woman they had dismissed, pitied, or ignored had fought back and won, without screaming, without lying, without becoming as ruthless as the man she exposed. Under the painted gaze of my husband's portrait, I let the applause wash over me, not as a trophy, not as a triumph, but as a confirmation. The inheritance he had left me was not a burden. It was a charge, and I had answered it. The banquet broke apart slowly that night, like a wave receding from the shore. Some guests slipped out with their coats held close, eyes wide and voices hushed. Others stayed in small circles, speaking in low tones, stealing glances in my direction, as if they had seen me for the first time. In the days that followed, the story left the walls of the hall.
Newspapers carried the scandal. Business journals carved it apart from every angle: legal, financial, ethical. Some reporters wrote of a fraudulent cousin brought to justice. Others, more careful, began to write about the quiet role I had played for years and the storm I had finally become. I did not seek attention. I answered no questions beyond a single written statement Jonas helped me prepare. "My husband believed in building, not destroying," it read. "The steps we have taken are not revenge. They are restoration." The trial began within months. I sat through every hearing, listening as auditors and former allies laid out the theft Grant had already traced. Stellan's lawyers called him careless, not cruel, but the evidence did not bend. When the jury foreman spoke guilty on every count, I did not cheer. I simply released the breath I had been holding since I first opened that envelope. Inside the company, we rewrote policies, hired honest auditors, and walked sunlight into corners that had been kept from me. An older foreman at the first mill removed his cap one afternoon and said, "Mrs. Harrow, we always knew you had more steel than they saw." His words settled where my humiliation once lived and turned it into something steadier. Seasons turned. The valley greened. The buildings Grant raised kept humming beneath steadier hands. Some evenings, I walked alone past the office windows, remembering the cheap first desk we shared and how we believed effort and loyalty would always be enough. Now, I know better. If betrayal taught me anything, it is that love does not excuse blindness, and that when a woman finally believes what she sees, she becomes someone no conspirator can quietly erase. My name is Lydia Harrow. I was once the woman others pitied, the one they expected to vanish quietly. Instead, I am still here. The company bears my husband's name, but the story of its survival bears mine as well.
If you have ever forgiven someone who did not deserve it or stayed longer than wisdom allowed, tell me in the comments. Your story may be the courage another woman needs. And before you leave, subscribe and drop a comment. You never know which story will finally help you choose yourself. Thank you so much for listening. See you in our next story.